The morning sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Elementary's playground as Sarah Martinez sipped her coffee and watched third graders race across the monkey bars during their Tuesday recess, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings that had stood sentinel over this neighborhood for nearly 40 years. She had been teaching at Jefferson for 8 of those years, and mornings like this reminded her why she had chosen education over the corporate job her parents had pushed her toward. There was something pure about children's joy that made even the most challenging days worthwhile. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of Mrs. Patterson's famous cinnamon rolls from the cafeteria, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that made Sarah believe the world was fundamentally good. But that tranquility shattered in an instant when she noticed movement near the front gate that didn't belong to the familiar rhythm of school life. 3 figures stumbled through the entrance, their gait unsteady and their clothes hanging in tatters that spoke of violence rather than neglect. Sarah's first instinct was concern rather than fear. Perhaps they were homeless individuals seeking help, or maybe someone had been in an accident and needed medical attention. She set down her coffee mug on the wooden picnic table where she had been grading papers and walked toward the gate, her teacher's instincts compelling her to help anyone in distress. The figures moved with an odd, mechanical persistence that made her pause halfway across the playground, her hand instinctively reaching for the whistle around her neck that all teachers carried for emergencies. Something about their movements triggered a primal warning in her brain, the same sensation she had felt years ago when walking alone at night and sensing danger in shadows. The closest figure, a middle-aged man in what had once been a business suit, turned toward the sound of children playing, and Sarah's blood froze as she saw his face. His skin was a sickly gray color, mottled with dark veins that pulsed beneath the surface like infected rivers, and his eyes held no recognition, no humanity, only a terrible hunger that made her stomach lurch with instinctive revulsion. When Jim Rodriguez, the school's maintenance supervisor, approached the intruders with his usual helpful demeanor, Sarah tried to call out a warning, but her voice caught in her throat as she watched the nightmare unfold. The gray-skinned man lunged at Jim with surprising speed, his mouth opening to reveal blackened teeth that sank into the maintenance worker's shoulder with a wet, tearing sound that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. Jim's scream of pain and terror cut through the playground chatter like a blade, causing every child within hearing distance to stop their games and turn toward the source of the horrible sound. Chaos erupted instantly as more figures began pouring through the gate, some moving with the same mechanical stumble, others displaying frightening bursts of speed as they caught sight of the children. Sarah's training kicked in as she blew her whistle in 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for immediate danger that sent teachers running toward their assigned emergency positions while children stood frozen in confusion and growing terror. The peaceful morning had transformed into a living nightmare, and as Sarah grabbed the nearest group of students and began pushing them toward the main building, she could hear the sound of more screams mixing with an inhuman moaning that seemed to come from the throats of the intruders. Her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. People who moved like humans but no longer seemed human, whose very presence radiated a wrongness that defied explanation. As she herded children through the main entrance, Sarah caught a glimpse of Principal Davis frantically speaking into his radio while simultaneously activating the school's lockdown procedures, his usually calm demeanor cracking under the weight of a crisis no training had prepared him for. The electronic tone of the lockdown alert began blaring through the hallways, a sound that had once meant nothing more than practice drills but now carried the weight of genuine life-or-death urgency. Sarah's last coherent thought before adrenaline completely took over was a desperate prayer that whatever was happening outside would stay outside. But even as she helped slam the heavy doors shut and engage the security locks, she could see more figures stumbling across the playground, their numbers growing with each passing second, and she knew with terrible certainty that the schoolyard would never be safe again. Principal Davis's voice crackled through the intercom system with barely controlled urgency as he announced the lockdown, his words echoing through hallways that had suddenly become corridors of terror rather than learning. Sarah pushed the last of her third-grade students through the main entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she caught glimpses of more figures stumbling across the parking lot beyond the playground, their numbers seeming to multiply with each passing moment like some horrible mathematics lesson come to life. The heavy security doors slammed shut with a metallic finality that should have brought relief, but instead only amplified the sounds of chaos from outside, screams, crashes, and that inhuman moaning that seemed to seep through the walls and settle into everyone's bones. Inside the main hallway, teachers herded confused and frightened children toward their designated emergency positions, but the standard lockdown procedures they had practiced monthly suddenly felt woefully inadequate for a threat that defied all logical explanation. Mrs. Henderson from the kindergarten class stumbled past with tears streaming down her face, clutching a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and Sarah realized that whatever was happening outside had already claimed victims among the staff who had been caught in the open. The school's PA system buzzed with static before Principal Davis's voice returned, now stripped of its professional calm and revealing the raw fear beneath. All staff and students proceed immediately to secure locations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Avoid all windows and exterior doors. Emergency services have been contacted. But even as he spoke, Sarah could hear the doubt in his voice, the growing realization that whatever emergency services might normally provide, they were likely overwhelmed by the scope of whatever was unfolding across the city. Gym teacher Marcus Thompson appeared at Sarah's side, his usual easy smile replaced by grim determination as he guided a group of older students down the hallway toward the gymnasium. "We need to get everyone away from the windows," he said in a low voice meant only for Sarah's ears. "I saw at least 20 more of those things coming across the field from the residential area. They're drawn to the sound of the kids." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately that the gymnasium, with its high windows and multiple entrances, might offer the space they needed to keep the children together while providing better defensive positions than the scattered classrooms. Together, they began organizing the evacuation to the gym, their teacher voices automatically shifting into the calm, authoritative tones that helped maintain order even as their own minds reeled with questions that had no answers. The gymnasium doors sealed behind them with 37 students ranging from kindergarten through 5th grade, plus Sarah, Marcus, and art teacher Elena Vasquez, who had arrived breathless and shaking after witnessing something through her classroom window that she couldn't yet put into words. The children huddled together on the polished wooden floor, their earlier playground energy transformed into nervous whispers and stifled sobs as the reality of the situation began to sink in despite their young ages. Marcus immediately began organizing the older students to help move the heavy wooden bleachers against the main doors, turning the emergency situation into a collaborative effort that gave everyone something to focus on besides their fear. Sarah found herself automatically counting heads, a habit ingrained by years of field trips and fire drills, but now carrying life-or-death importance as she ensured that every child under their protection was accounted for. Elena managed to tune the emergency radio to a local news station, but the reports they heard only confirmed their worst fears. Similar incidents were being reported across the city, with emergency services overwhelmed and evacuation centers being established for those who could reach them safely. The radio crackled with fragmented reports of hospitals overrun, police stations under siege, and entire neighborhoods going dark as communication systems failed under the unprecedented crisis. Outside the gymnasium's high windows, they could see movement in the parking lot as more figures wandered aimlessly between the cars, some still wearing the normal clothes of suburban life but all sharing that same gray pallor and mechanical gait that marked them as something no longer quite human. The children pressed closer together as the sounds from outside grew louder, not just the moaning now, but the crash of breaking glass and the scrape of fingernails against metal as the creatures tested every barrier between themselves and the living people they seemed compelled to reach. Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus and Elena, all three understanding without words that their afternoon had become about much more than education. They were now the thin line between 37 innocent children and a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable, and failure was not an option they could afford to consider. The relative safety of the gymnasium proved to be an illusion that shattered along with the cafeteria windows 3 hours after the initial lockdown, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the school's corridors like gunshots that made every child jump and several begin crying in earnest. Sarah had been trying to keep the younger students calm by leading them in quiet songs when the crash interrupted her mid-verse, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet and that horrible moaning that had become the soundtrack to their nightmare. Marcus held up his hand for silence, his head tilted toward the gymnasium doors as he listened to sounds that didn't belong in their school, the scrape of chairs being overturned, the bang of cabinet doors, and underneath it all, a wet dragging sound that made Sarah's skin crawl with its implications. Elena clutched the emergency radio tighter, her knuckles white as she tried to tune in clearer signals, but the static seemed to be getting worse rather than better, as if the very infrastructure of communication was breaking down along with everything else they had taken for granted. The children sensed the adults' growing tension despite their efforts to maintain calm facades, and 10-year-old Jamie Morrison whispered the question they were all thinking: "Are those monsters going to find us in here?" Before Sarah could formulate a reassuring response that wouldn't be an outright lie, the gymnasium doors shuddered under impact from the other side, and they all heard Jim Rodriguez's voice calling out in desperate urgency. "Let me in. Please, they're right behind me." Marcus looked to Sarah with anguish written across his face, both of them knowing that opening the doors meant potentially letting in whatever was chasing the maintenance supervisor, but also knowing they couldn't abandon a colleague who might still be saved. The decision was made for them when Jim's voice rose to a scream of pure terror, followed by sounds that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years: the wet tearing of fabric and flesh, the gurgling cry of a man fighting for his life, and then a silence that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Elena covered her mouth to stifle a sob while Marcus wrapped his arms around the nearest group of children, pulling them away from the doors as something began pounding against them with renewed fury, no longer the random stumbling of confused creatures but the determined assault of predators who had caught the scent of prey. The wooden bleachers they had stacked against the doors groaned under the impact, and Sarah realized with growing horror that their makeshift barricade might not hold against a concentrated attack. Through the high windows she could see more figures converging on the school building, drawn by the commotion and the promise of victims trapped inside, their gray faces turned upward with expressions of mindless hunger that made her stomach turn. Jim's sacrifice had bought them time, but at a cost that made the reality of their situation crash down on everyone in the gymnasium with brutal clarity. This wasn't a temporary emergency that would be resolved by morning, and people they cared about were dying while they huddled together in increasingly fragile safety. The pounding on the doors intensified, joined now by the sound of windows being tested along the exterior walls, and Sarah knew they needed to move before their current position became their tomb. Marcus seemed to reach the same conclusion simultaneously, his eyes meeting hers across the huddle of frightened children as he mouthed the words, "second floor," and gestured toward the emergency exit that led to the interior stairwell. Elena gathered the radio and their meager supplies while Sarah organized the children into a quiet line, whispering instructions about staying silent and staying together as they prepared to abandon their refuge for the unknown dangers of the school's upper level. The youngest children clung to their teachers' hands with desperate strength, their trust both heartbreaking and motivating as Sarah realized that 37 lives now depended on decisions she was making moment by moment without any training or preparation for leadership in hell. As Marcus carefully opened the interior door and peered into the hallway beyond, the sounds from the cafeteria grew louder, and they could hear the creatures spreading through the building with methodical persistence, testing every door and window in their relentless search for living prey. The hallway stretched before them like a gauntlet, familiar territory transformed into alien landscape where every shadow might hide death and every sound could bring disaster, but staying meant certain discovery and probable doom. Sarah took one last look at the gymnasium that had briefly represented safety, knowing that Jim Rodriguez had died to give them this chance to escape, and she silently promised his memory that his sacrifice would not be in vain as she helped guide the first group of children toward whatever uncertain sanctuary they might find on the second floor of a school that no longer felt like home. The second-floor computer lab felt like entering a different world entirely, its rows of silent monitors and ergonomic chairs a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the rest of Jefferson Elementary, and for a moment Sarah allowed herself to believe they might have found genuine sanctuary in this temple of modern learning. The heavy fire door clicked shut behind them with reassuring finality, and Marcus immediately began his inspection of the room's defensive capabilities while Sarah counted heads once again, her heart finally slowing from its frantic pace when she confirmed that all 37 children had made the harrowing journey up the stairwell without loss. Elena positioned herself by the single window, keeping watch over the playground where more figures continued to wander between the swing sets and jungle gym with purposeless persistence, their presence transforming familiar childhood landmarks into monuments to a world gone mad. The computer lab offered several advantages over the gymnasium: only one entrance to defend, windows too high for easy access from the ground, and thick walls that muffled the sounds from below. But it also felt like a trap if they needed to escape quickly, with no alternate exits and a single stairwell that could easily become a bottleneck of death. Sarah was organizing the children into smaller groups to make them easier to manage when a soft knocking sound from the storage closet made everyone freeze in terror, the gentle rhythm so distinctly human that it seemed impossible given their circumstances. Marcus grabbed a computer monitor cable to use as a makeshift weapon while motioning for everyone to stay back. His approach to the closet door methodical and careful as years of coaching youth sports had taught him to expect the unexpected while keeping safety as the top priority. The voice that emerged from behind the door was young, male, and speaking in rapid, nervous sentences that tumbled over each other in relief and desperation. "Please don't hurt me, I'm not one of them, I'm Alex Chin from Jefferson High. I was visiting my little sister Lucy when this whole thing started and I've been hiding in here since the lockdown began because I heard what happened to Mr. Rodriguez and I didn't know if there were more people or just those things running around the building." Sarah felt a wave of recognition at the mention of Lucy Chin, a bright second grader who was supposed to be in Mrs. Patterson's class, and her heart sank as she realized the girl wasn't among their group of survivors, which meant she was either safely evacuated earlier or had become another casualty of the morning's horror. Marcus opened the closet door cautiously to reveal a teenager who looked remarkably composed despite the circumstances. His dark hair disheveled but his eyes sharp and alert as he took in the group of survivors with the quick assessment of someone who had been thinking strategically about survival rather than simply reacting to crisis. Alex proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge that none of the adults possessed, his years of playing survival video games and watching military documentaries translating into surprisingly useful insights about defensive positioning, resource management, and the importance of maintaining quiet discipline when hiding from enemies with enhanced hearing. He immediately began helping Marcus reinforce their barricades using computer equipment and furniture while explaining in whispered tones how they could create multiple layers of defense and early warning systems using the room's existing technology and furniture arrangement. Even more valuable was Alex's calm demeanor around the children, many of whom were closer to his age than to the adults, and he quickly became an intermediary who could communicate adult decisions in terms that didn't increase their fear while still maintaining the discipline necessary for their survival. His first suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity, using the computer lab's internal phone system to check other areas of the building for additional survivors, a possibility that hadn't occurred to any of the adults in their focus on immediate defense and child protection. As Alex began systematically calling different classroom extensions, Sarah found herself grateful for this unexpected addition to their group, recognizing that survival would require more than just adult authority and good intentions, but also the kind of creative problem-solving that came naturally to a generation raised on interactive challenges and strategic thinking. The teenagers' presence also seemed to boost the morale of the older students, who began volunteering for small tasks and responsibilities instead of simply huddling together in fear, creating a more collaborative atmosphere that made their cramped quarters feel less like a prison and more like a fortress held by determined defenders. When Rosa Gutierrez's voice crackled through the intercom from the principal's office, alive and coherent and reporting that she had access to building schematics and emergency supplies, Alex was the first to suggest they establish regular communication schedules and begin coordinating their efforts as a larger survivor network rather than isolated groups hoping to outlast the crisis through passive hiding alone. By late afternoon, the harsh reality of their situation became impossible to ignore as the children's lunch boxes had been emptied hours ago and the single water bottle Elena had grabbed during their escape was nearly drained, leaving 37 frightened people facing the prospect of dehydration and hunger while trapped in a building surrounded by creatures that showed no signs of losing interest in their location. Rosa's voice through the intercom had provided crucial intelligence about the school's layout and confirmed that the cafeteria's walk-in storage room contained enough emergency supplies to sustain them for several days, but reaching those supplies meant traversing corridors that had become hunting grounds for an unknown number of infected individuals who seemed to grow more aggressive as the day wore on. Marcus volunteered immediately for the dangerous mission, his protective instincts as both a teacher and coach making the decision automatic despite the obvious risks. But Sarah refused to let him go alone, arguing that two people would have better chances of success and could carry more supplies back to the group. Alex wanted to join them, his teenage confidence in his own abilities clashing with the adults' determination to keep him safe with the younger children, but his strategic mind proved invaluable in planning their route and timing their departure for maximum stealth and minimum exposure to the creatures below. The plan they developed was deceptively simple but required precise execution and nerves of steel. They would wait until the creature's attention was focused on the far side of the building, then move quickly through the administrative offices to reach the cafeteria, gather as many supplies as possible, and return before their absence triggered a search pattern that could lead the infected back to the computer lab. Rosa's detailed knowledge of the building's layout proved crucial as she guided them through the intercom system, directing them away from areas where she had seen movement and toward corridors that offered the best combination of cover and quick escape routes if things went wrong. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she and Marcus crept down the main stairwell, every creak of the old building's settling bones sounding like thunder in her ears while the distant moaning and shuffling of the infected served as a constant reminder that discovery meant death for not just themselves but for all the children depending on their return. The administrative hallway stretched before them like a gauntlet, familiar territory transformed into alien landscape where every shadow could hide a creature and every doorway might conceal an ambush, but they moved with careful determination, using hand signals Alex had taught them and staying low to avoid the windows that might reveal their movement to the infected wandering the grounds outside. The cafeteria doors stood slightly ajar, a detail that made Sarah's blood run cold as she realized it meant the creatures had already been inside, but Marcus squeezed her shoulder reassuringly and pointed toward the storage room at the far end, its heavy metal door still intact and promising the supplies they desperately needed. Moving through the cafeteria felt like walking through a nightmare, with overturned tables and scattered lunch trays creating an obstacle course that had to be navigated in absolute silence while the afternoon sun streaming through the windows created shifting patterns of light and shadow that played tricks on their fear-heightened senses. The storage room door was locked, but Rosa had provided the combination to the keypad, and Sarah's fingers shook as she entered the numbers while Marcus kept watch, his improvised weapon ready and his body tense to fight if their presence was discovered before they could complete their mission. Inside the storage room, they found a treasure trove of emergency supplies, cases of bottled water, boxes of granola bars and crackers, first aid kits, and even battery-powered radios that could provide better communication than the building's failing intercom system. They worked with efficient urgency, stuffing backpacks and reusable shopping bags with as much as they could carry while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds from the cafeteria, where something had begun moving among the overturned furniture with the slow persistence that marked it as one of the infected rather than a fellow survivor. The return journey tested every nerve in their bodies as they retraced their steps through corridors that seemed to have grown more dangerous in their absence, the weight of their precious cargo making them slower and more vulnerable while the sounds of pursuit grew closer with each careful step toward the stairwell that represented their only path back to safety. When they finally reached the computer lab and sealed the door behind them, both Sarah and Marcus collapsed against the wall in exhaustion and relief, their successful mission providing not just the physical supplies needed for survival but also proof that careful planning and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds in a world where the rules of normal life no longer applied. Rosa's voice crackled through the emergency radio with barely contained excitement as she announced her breakthrough in establishing contact with the outside world, her words cutting through the evening gloom that had settled over their makeshift sanctuary like the first ray of hope they had experienced since the nightmare began 12 hours earlier. The battery-powered emergency radio that Marcus and Sarah had retrieved from the storage room proved to be far more powerful than the small device Elena had been using, and Rosa's technical expertise from her years maintaining the school's communication systems allowed her to access frequencies that had remained clear while the standard channels dissolved into static and chaos. Through a combination of determination and technical skill, she had managed to reach a military coordination center that was broadcasting regular updates about evacuation zones, safe houses, and the overall status of the crisis that had engulfed not just their city but apparently much of the surrounding region as well. The news Rosa relayed was a mixture of hope and harsh reality that left the adults struggling to process information that would have seemed like science fiction just 24 hours earlier but now represented their only pathway to survival and eventual safety. Military forces had established secure perimeters around 3 major evacuation centers within a 50-mile radius, with the closest located at the regional airport approximately 5 miles from Jefferson Elementary, but reaching any of these zones would require traveling through areas that were heavily populated by the infected and offered little cover for a group that included dozens of young children. The radio reports painted a picture of a world in chaos, with major population centers under siege and emergency services stretched beyond their breaking points, but they also confirmed that scientists and medical teams were working around the clock to understand the nature of the outbreak and develop countermeasures that might eventually restore order to a society that had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. More immediate hope came from contact with other survivor groups scattered throughout the city, including a team of firefighters barricaded in Station 19 about 2 miles away, a group of families trapped in the Riverside shopping mall, and most remarkably, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the regional hospital who was coordinating medical response efforts from a secured wing of the medical facility. Each group reported similar experiences: sudden onset of the crisis, rapid spread of infection, complete breakdown of normal communication and transportation systems, but also successful defensive strategies and proof that organized resistance could keep the infected at bay when properly coordinated and supplied. The firefighters at Station 19 had particularly valuable intelligence about the creature's behavior patterns, confirming Alex's earlier observations about their attraction to sound and movement while adding crucial details about their apparent weakness during daylight hours and their tendency to move in loose groups rather than coordinated attacks. Dr. Walsh's reports from the hospital provided the most disturbing information. The infection appeared to be transmitted through direct contact with infected bodily fluids, the transformation from human to creature occurred within minutes of exposure, and most critically, there was no known cure or treatment for individuals who had been infected, making prevention and avoidance the only viable survival strategies. The coordination between survivor groups began immediately, with each location sharing information about safe routes, resource locations, and observed patterns of creature movement that could help others plan their own survival strategies and eventual evacuation attempts. Rosa established regular communication schedules that would allow the groups to maintain contact without revealing their positions to any hostile listeners who might be monitoring emergency frequencies, and she began compiling a comprehensive map of safe zones, danger areas, and potential rally points based on reports from all the connected survivor groups. The most significant development came when the military coordinator announced that helicopter evacuations would begin at dawn from predetermined pickup points for groups that could demonstrate their ability to reach the designated locations safely and in an organized manner, with priority given to groups that included children, elderly individuals, or people with critical medical needs. Jefferson Elementary's group qualified on multiple criteria, but the designated pickup point was the roof of the Riverside Shopping Mall, which meant they would need to coordinate with the survivors already trapped there and plan a route that would take them through nearly 3 miles of infected territory while keeping 37 children safe and quiet. As Rosa continued her radio communications late into the evening, gathering intelligence and coordinating with other groups, Sarah found herself torn between hope and terror. Hope that rescue was finally within reach, but terror at the thought of leading children through streets that had become hunting grounds for creatures that showed no mercy or recognition of innocence. The radio chatter continued through the night, a lifeline of human voices in a world that had suddenly become very dark and very dangerous, but also proof that civilization had not completely collapsed and that there were still people fighting to restore order and safety to a world that had been transformed beyond recognition in a single terrible day. Dawn broke over Jefferson Elementary with an eerie silence that felt more ominous than the chaos of the previous day, as if the infected had retreated into shadows to wait for their next opportunity to hunt. But Sarah knew from Rosa's overnight radio communications that this quiet represented their best and possibly only chance to reach the helicopter evacuation point before the creatures resumed their daylight wandering patterns. The school buses sat in the parking lot like yellow beacons of hope, their familiar bulk promising transportation for a group too large to move effectively on foot, but reaching them meant crossing 50 yards of open ground where they would be completely exposed to any infected that might be lurking in the surrounding buildings or wandering the neighborhood streets. Marcus had spent the early morning hours conducting reconnaissance from the second-floor windows, using binoculars from the science department to map the positions of every visible creature and identify the safest route to the buses, while Alex worked with Rosa to coordinate their departure timing with the other survivor groups who would be converging on the Riverside Shopping Mall pickup point. The plan they developed was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its reliance on split-second timing. They would use the school's fire alarm system to create a massive distraction on the opposite side of the building, drawing any nearby infected away from the parking lot, while simultaneously deploying makeshift noisemakers at strategic points to maintain the diversion long enough for everyone to reach the buses and begin their escape. Sarah's heart pounded as she helped organize the children into groups of 6, each assigned to a specific adult and given clear instructions about staying quiet, moving quickly, and following directions without question, while Elena distributed the remaining granola bars and water bottles to ensure everyone had energy for what could be a long and dangerous journey. The weight of responsibility felt crushing as Sarah looked into the faces of children who trusted her completely to guide them through circumstances that would challenge experienced adults, but she drew strength from their resilience and determination, recognizing that they had already survived far more than anyone should have to endure. Rosa's voice crackled through the radio with final coordination details as the other survivor groups reported their readiness to begin their own evacuation attempts, creating a citywide exodus that would either result in mass rescue or tragic disaster depending on the success of their carefully orchestrated timing. Marcus took his position at the main entrance with the first group of children, his improvised weapon ready and his eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement, while Alex positioned himself at the emergency exit with the second group, both men understanding that they would need to fight if necessary to protect the children under their care. The fire alarm shrieked to life with ear-splitting intensity, its piercing wail echoing off the surrounding buildings and immediately drawing moans and shuffling sounds from multiple directions as the infected responded to the noise with predictable urgency, their forms visible in the distance as they stumbled toward the source of the disturbance with single-minded determination. Sarah held her breath as Marcus led the first group across the parking lot, their small forms moving with surprising speed and discipline as they reached the nearest bus and began boarding with the quiet efficiency they had practiced during their brief morning rehearsal. The second group followed immediately, with Alex bringing up the rear and constantly checking over his shoulder for signs of pursuit, while Elena took charge of starting the lead bus and Sarah prepared to drive the second vehicle in a convoy that would need to navigate through streets that had become obstacle courses of abandoned cars and roaming predators. The engines roared to life with sounds that seemed deafeningly loud after hours of enforced silence, But there was no time for stealth as more infected began appearing from side streets and residential areas, drawn by the noise and the movement of their escaping prey. Sarah gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles as she followed Marcus's bus out of the parking lot and onto the main road, weaving between abandoned vehicles while watching her mirrors for signs that they were being followed by the shambling figures that had begun converging on their route. The radio crackled with reports from other evacuation groups, some successful, others encountering heavy resistance. But Sarah focused entirely on the road ahead and the precious cargo of children whose lives depended on her driving skills and the route planning that would either deliver them to safety or lead them into a trap from which there might be no escape. The convoy picked up speed as they reached the main thoroughfare, racing against time and the growing number of infected that seemed to emerge from every shadow and doorway, their escape becoming a desperate chase through a city that had been transformed overnight from a place of suburban comfort into a landscape of unimaginable horror. The military checkpoint at Riverside Shopping Mall appeared through the morning haze like a vision from a different world, its razor-wire perimeters and armed soldiers representing civilization's stubborn refusal to surrender to the chaos that had consumed so much of their city in less than 24 hours. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she guided the school bus through the final security screening, her body still flooded with adrenaline from the harrowing journey that had taken them through streets littered with abandoned vehicles and past buildings where infected faces pressed against windows in futile hunger. The children who had started this nightmare as ordinary students worried about homework and playground games now sat quietly in their seats with the kind of composure that spoke to experiences no child should ever have to endure, but also to a resilience that gave Sarah hope for their ability to heal and rebuild their lives in whatever world emerged from this crisis. Marcus emerged from the lead bus with a smile that mixed exhaustion and relief in equal measure, his protective instincts finally able to relax as armed soldiers took over the responsibility for their safety and began the process of medical screening and registration that would officially mark their transition from survivors to refugees. The helicopter landing pad buzzed with activity as military personnel coordinated the evacuation of multiple survivor groups, their efficient professionalism a stark contrast to the desperate improvisation that had characterized the past day. And Sarah felt tears of gratitude streaming down her face as she realized that 37 children would live to see their families again because of decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Alex helped organize the younger students into processing lines with the same strategic thinking that had served them so well during their ordeal, but now his skills were focused on reunion rather than survival as social workers began the complex task of reconnecting children with relatives who had been evacuated to different safe zones throughout the region. Elena clutched the emergency radio that had been their lifeline to the outside world, reluctant to surrender the device that had meant the difference between isolation and hope, but also eager to rejoin a society where communication systems functioned normally and emergency broadcasts dealt with weather reports rather than survival instructions. Rosa's technical expertise proved valuable even in the evacuation center as she helped military communications specialists coordinate with other survivor groups still trapped throughout the city, her intimate knowledge of the school district's infrastructure providing crucial intelligence for ongoing rescue operations. The medical tent buzzed with activity as doctors and nurses examined each member of their group, their gentle efficiency a welcome contrast to the harsh realities of the past day, and Sarah felt profound relief when every single child received a clean bill of health despite their traumatic experiences. As they waited for transport to the main evacuation facility, Sarah found herself reflecting on how quickly ordinary people had been transformed into heroes by circumstances that demanded nothing less than extraordinary courage and selflessness from everyone involved in their survival. The children began to open up as the reality of their safety sank in, sharing stories and fears that had been suppressed during their hours of enforced silence, and Sarah marveled at their ability to process trauma with the kind of resilience that suggested they would eventually recover from experiences that would have broken many adults. News reports filtering through the evacuation center painted a sobering picture of a world fundamentally changed by the outbreak, with major cities under military control and entire regions declared quarantine zones. But they also spoke of scientific breakthroughs and coordinated international response efforts that offered hope for eventual recovery and reconstruction. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the evacuation center as families began to reunite, their tears of joy and relief providing a counterpoint to the grief and loss that had marked so much of the crisis, and Sarah felt a deep sense of purpose knowing that her choices had contributed to these moments of human triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Marcus approached her as they prepared to board the transport helicopter, his expression serious but hopeful as he spoke about the responsibility they would all share for helping these children process their experiences and rebuild their sense of security in a world that had revealed its capacity for sudden, devastating change. The helicopter lifted off with a mechanical roar that carried them away from the shopping mall and toward a future that remained uncertain but no longer seemed hopeless, and Sarah looked down at the city below, scarred but not destroyed, wounded but not dead, and felt a quiet confidence that human beings would find ways to heal and rebuild just as they had found ways to survive and protect each other when everything familiar had been stripped away. As the evacuation center grew smaller in the distance, Sarah held the hand of a kindergartner who had asked her to promise that tomorrow would be better than today, and she realized that keeping that promise would require the same courage and determination that had brought them through their darkest hours, but now applied to the equally challenging task of building hope from the ashes of a world that would never be quite the same again.